Hello, my name is Chris Hightower. I'm the Executive Director at the Arlington Museum of Art. We have two exhibits right now, the Harlem Renaissance, and on the mezzanine we have the William H. Johnson Smithsonian exhibition. The Harlem Renaissance exhibit is about a group of people that were finding their way and finding their voice during the last turn of the century from the 1900s to the 1950s. And really the Harlem Renaissance is known for the 20s and 30s. It had to do with more than just visual arts. It was music. The Cotton Club was popular. Langston Hughes, poetry, the spoken word. So many of these things were popular in the Harlem Renaissance. And at the beginning of this exhibit, what we're going to see is where they started off. And so that's how the Harlem Renaissance is kicked off here at the Arlington Museum of Art. This would be our first piece in the Harlem Renaissance exhibit. It's really before the Harlem Renaissance started. Grafton Tyler Brown was an artist from New York who ended up moving west in search of his own hopes, trying to escape the East and oppression. And as you'll see in this piece, the train and it's heading west where the sun is setting, and that's where the hope and the excitement of something new to come. This is a little bit about his hopes, his dreams, not only for himself but for the people that he represented. And as you'll notice, this piece is also very realistic. At the time that he was painting, at the late 19th century, there was lots of realism was popular. It started to move into Impressionism, which we'll talk about here soon. So this next piece, you can tell, is a bronze, three-dimensional piece from Richmond Barthet. He grew up around the turn of the last century, and the figure, of course, is very classical. It's lyrical. In fact, this one's called Inner Music, and so it has a quality of the old-style Greek imagery that you might think of in a Greek sculpture, with a little bit of the Romantic period coming out with the music kind of playing. And we'll see as the exhibit progresses that what's happening here with all of these artists is that they're really trying to kind of find their voice and what is African American art about? What does it mean? What does it look like? And so you can see between these last two pieces that they started off imitating what was popular in the day from European masters and what was going on over in Paris and Europe of the day. In this piece you can see we're moving out of the classical and realism phase and looking more at impressionistic period. This particular piece almost has quality of Seurat where it's pointillism, so the detail is very fine, but also the image is a little bit blurry. The style is very reminiscent of what was going on in European masters, but the content is very different. The content is what's important to these particular artists of the day, and this particular piece is a landscape of a Haitian countryside. And Haiti was important to African Americans at the last turn of the century because they were the first Western country to be their own black represented country in the Western Hemisphere. So that's why Haiti plays such a critical part. And of course, at the turn of our last century, that's why it was so powerful and meaningful to these artists in the Harlem Renaissance. This piece by Hale Woodruff around 1930, we can still see the similar kinds of things that were happening from the European masters. So what was going on at the time, we had Impressionism around the turn of this last century, moving into Expressionism, and what was a critical turning point to many of the artists that were operating in the day was there was an African exhibit held in Paris. One of the pieces that Picasso saw really inspired some of his most famous pieces like Demoiselles d'Avignon. And as you'll see in this woman's face, she has those same similar features that you might see in an African mask. Also, the content of this one looks like it's on a shore or a beach and is very reminiscent of Gauguin. And he was very well known for painting Tahitian beauties. So in this piece you can definitely see that these artists were copying or patterning their own styles based on what was popular in the day. So the same is true with Bob Thompson's work here. The difference in this piece and the previous piece that we saw by Hale Woodruff, we see the content is very similar. It has that Gauguin style of being by a shoreline. The difference here is you see the color plating. You've got large objects that are starting to form in large color shapes. And that really starts to define what this movement and what the artwork was about of this group of artists, and then William H. Johnson, and we'll see that in the next exhibit. With these two from Jacob Lawrence, we can see the color and the shape blocking that we saw from the Bob Thompson. You can also see some things that are going on with the top of the table. The table has almost been flattened so that you can see the top of the table, and you can see a frontal view of the card players in these pieces. So the image has actually been flattened. This was very popular with Cézanne at the time, and it would almost give you a sense that something was going to fall off the front of the table, even though it's not. Picasso and Cubism, his concept was to show you different views of one particular snapshot. These two are a part of a four-piece set, and here we have the diamond and the spade. These two were actually found in someone's basement. Somebody had been using them as a dartboard. And if you get close enough on this one, you can actually see there are some holes in the piece where it has been restored. The pieces were also severed. So the top part was severed from the bottom part. And this particular collector has found these pieces, put them back together, had them restored, and this is the first time they've actually been on view. And they are definitely a four-part piece, so it would have divided a room for somebody. The two pieces of the series that would have joined the four to make the screen, the club and the heart, are missing. Probably somebody has them somewhere. We're not really sure where they are. They could be severed. They could be used for some other alternative purpose. We really don't know. But these two, luckily, were saved pieces. So these are really kind of fun pieces, but also very interesting and very special pieces. This piece by Charles White really is indicative of the Harlem Renaissance. It really explains what was going on in these artists' minds and how they were feeling about what was going on in their world. You can see, if you look carefully in his face, there's some sadness in his eyes, and his left eye almost looks like it's going to tear up. But you can see in the lines around him that he's playing the accordion, and so you can tell that there's a song in his heart. You can tell that the artist is trying to say that they're going to overcome the challenges that are in front of them. And while this person feels downtrodden at the time, he knows that there's hope beyond the corner. This piece is a really pivotal piece for this particular exhibit because it really encapsulates everything that these artists were feeling in the day. This piece by Charles White seems to be a fan favorite. Everybody that comes in the museum, this is probably one of their most favorite pieces. Of course, it's one of the more recognizable pieces because it's one of our presidents, Abraham Lincoln. Of course, what he represents to the people in the day is the freedom and emancipation. From what we just came from, you could see that there was some sadness and some hope for some things to change for these people and these artists. And what you see now is that they're seeing the hope. It's starting to appear around the corner. This one was done in 1952, and so it's at the very beginning part of the civil rights movement. And so you can see why this piece would certainly be a rallying cry for the artists, also for the people of the movement. It also was a very emblematic piece of the movement and for the people. So as you can see in this piece, it's by Charles White as well. This one is also with people with instruments. You can see in their faces, they're not as sad, they're not as concerned. There's much more hope in this one, there's more color in this one. You can also see that it appears to be in a church. A lot of the civil rights movement happened out of the churches out of the South. And so in this piece you can start to see that the hope is alive and people are feeling that hope. And it has a very different feel than the boy with accordion that we saw. This piece by Ellis Wilson, mid to late 40s. We've got a man and a lobster staring in each other's eyes. And you can see that there's a battle going on, and who's going to win is the question here. The lobster seems to be oversized. The man may seem to be a little too small. But the story that this one is telling is, we've come so far, but we still have a ways to go. There's still some movement that we need to make. We haven't reached that top plateau yet. So this one is a really fascinating piece. It's a very deep piece, very spiritual almost, and once you start thinking about it and thinking about how the people in the day were feeling at the moment. This piece by Huey Lee Smith shows us a sailor from 1945. This is a young sailor that's returned from war, from World War II, and he looks larger than the chair that he's sitting in. The chair is a desk chair maybe from an elementary school. And so when he comes back from serving his country and fighting for his country, he feels like he's still treated as a child. So there's still some room to move. We haven't quite made it. So he's been able to serve his country, but he's not yet where he wants to be with his civil rights. And so that's what we get to see in this really passionate piece by Huey Lee Smith. While the Harlem Renaissance exhibit tells a group's journey at finding their own voice and leads up to the civil rights movement, the William H. Johnson exhibit really focuses in on one man's journey and his life, his love affair with his wife, and then with her death, and then what happens to him. And both exhibits together are almost a mirror of each other, of what's going on at the same time, miles apart from each other. The piece by William H. Johnson is really a great piece because it sets the tone for this exhibit. It shows that he was doing exactly what some of the other people were doing. They were copying the style of other great artists of the day. This particular artist looks very similar to Cézanne's work from the south of France. It's very emblematic of that same period where it's moving out of the Impressionism, starting to move into Expressionism, which we'll see a little bit more here in just a minute. But definitely you can see the connection to Cézanne and what's going on in France. This, you can see that the curvature of the buildings really sets this one apart from the previous one that was more blocked. We're starting to see that William H. Johnson's really searching for kind of his style and what he's looking for. In the day, you might remember Van Gogh and the swirling things that were happening. And this piece to our left, we can see a sense of the Scream from Edward Munch, where you've got a man in the image, but the image is distorted. And so you can see the ties to the masters that were operating in the time. William H. Johnson was born in Florence, South Carolina, and as a young man he studied art and studied the masters and went up to Harlem when he was in his teens, and then before he moved overseas and studied in Europe. When he goes to Europe, he really embeds himself into Scandinavia, and with this series of paintings you can see that in this one definitely has a tie to Matisse's work. You can also start to see the color blocking that's going on. You've got the thick paint, but definitely you have the love of environment that he was kind of playing around with at the time that he was in Denmark. The same with this one. We've talked about this with Jacob Lawrence before, where Cézanne would flatten the table out so you'd get the sense of the top of the table. For this one, you've got the color blocking with solid shapes and hard-edged lines. And you also get to see the top of the table where you're not really sure if something's going to slide off the front of the table or not. And so these two, you get to see he's clearly moving towards the color blocking and really trying to find his own voice, but looking at what the popular artists of the day were doing and trying to replicate those styles to see if his style is going to match any of those. So we can definitely see that in these two pieces. Here's the third set in this series. We can see that he's moving away from the color blocking and playing with Expressionism. Expressionism very clearly it becomes popular with Van Gogh. This is a landscape of, again, the environment. So we see his love of the environment and his thinking about the environment and how important it is. At this time, he's living in Denmark. He meets his soon-to-be wife and really falls in love with the environment and the place and people. And with this piece, we can definitely see a progression where he's trying to play around with different styles that are popular to really hone in on what his voice is going to be. What does he have to tell people? And so that's what I really love about these three pieces. These four landscapes, we can definitely see where William H. Johnson is falling in love with Denmark. He's met someone that he is romantically involved with, and he also really loves the nature that he sees around him. And definitely we see it in all four of these pieces. You see the boating villages. These again are emblematic of the similar styles that we saw before, only he's really concentrating in on the color blocking. So here you can see real solid blocks of color with large brush strokes. So you really start to see that he's developing his voice, but he's passionate about some things. He just hasn't refined it quite yet. But it's starting to come into focus here. And definitely in these four pieces you can see that happening, particularly as we move to this side where we've got the blocked houses and the blocked boats on the water, and then a house at the very end. We start to see it has a primitive quality about it, but it's still tied to the nature and tied to what he's passionate about, which is the environment. These three pieces really show where William H. Johnson was going with his work. He definitely had a love of his past and his history, and these pieces are definitely of the folk art, primitive art style. So the color blocking continues in these three, and these are also done generally on paper with some materials he can find, the paint that he can find. It's very similar to a tempera paint. They're very delicate pieces, and we're so excited to have them. They almost didn't make it to the Smithsonian. The Harmon Foundation came in and saved them at the last minute along with the rest of the exhibit and donated them to what's now the Smithsonian Institute back in the middle of the last century. So these are very interesting pieces. They also show his style that he's really known for. Of course, you can see behind their heads there's what is known in the art world as a halo in Christian art. It's a very popular theme. And so these are people that would be saints or holy people. The interesting thing about some of these pieces is the materials that he had to use. This one was painted on a window shade. And so they're very delicate pieces. And so he didn't really have lots of money. He and his wife didn't have a lot of money. She had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and so they had to do what they could and make do with the materials that they had available to them, because her health was clearly more important than the materials that they were using at the time. So they got pretty creative here, and these pieces are very delicate and very rare, fragile pieces. This piece is entitled Aunt Alice, but it's widely known that it's his mother. This is actually, if you kind of look at it carefully, it could be two separate paintings. So you've got the right side here with the darker side, and then you've got the side on the left where it looks like she's a seated figure. But on the right, if you cover your eyes, you almost look like she's standing. So there's a question, is she standing, is she sitting? What's going on exactly in this piece? It's a really fascinating piece. You can also see William Johnson playing with perspective. This table right here, is the vase going to slide off the front of the table or not? So it's a really interesting piece. He's definitely developed and really fine-tuning his style. Both exhibits will be on display until August 26th, so come down and visit us.